class, thank you so much for joining me again today. So where we left off last time is with a set of theories that was developed in the 1950s, essentially asking how prejudices affect economic interactions, particularly in the labor market. And they did so by essentially assuming that prejudice itself is not going to be explained through economic analysis. It's just an aspect of the way people feel about their decisions, the way people make decisions, that comes from somewhere outside of the model, right? Which is to say, we treated prejudice as exogenous. And what we concluded from our economic theory is that essentially market interactions force prejudiced individuals to pay what we might think of as a bigot tax. If you're an employer and you preferentially hire white workers over non-white workers, or men over women, or any privileged versus an underprivileged group, the consequence is that you pay more for labor, you earn lower profits than you would if you were unprejudiced. Likewise, if you're a customer, right, who prefers doing business or interacting with majority group members, right, privileged group members over less privileged group members, you're going to have to pay a premium in order to do so, right? And the more important prejudice is in determining wage differences or differences in opportunity between privileged and less privileged groups, the bigger that bigot tax is going to be. The problem with this theory, right, and the kind of mystery we were left with at the end of last class, is that if we take this theory very seriously and we add some strong assumptions, right, like perfectly competitive markets and a potentially unlimited pool of unprejudiced entrepreneurs who could potentially enter a market, we should expect that this bigot tax should force prejudice out of the market over time, right? We should expect that less prejudiced individuals should earn profits. Those profits should drive competitors out of business. But when we look at the real world, there's not much evidence of this happening, right? If we look at the real world, we see that discrimination and prejudice tends to maintain itself over time, even over very long periods of time, right? Both in, competitive market economies, in less competitive economies, right? The only time periods in which we see discrimination and prejudice really decreasing are time periods when there's concerted efforts to address that discrimination and prejudice legally, right? For example, during the civil rights movement. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at a couple of theories that are trying to understand this disconnect. And the way these theories are going to do so is by no longer treating prejudice as something that comes from outside of the model, right? Something that people enter an economy with. Instead, what these models are going to do is try to think about ways in which market interactions might actually maintain or reward prejudices in order to keep them salient over time. So we're going to start with the simplest version of this model, which is a model of statistical discrimination. We're starting with statistical discrimination because it's one of the really important building blocks for a lot of these models trying to understand basically dynamic systems of discrimination. So the basic idea here, right, the fundamental idea of statistical discrimination is that instead of assuming that discriminatory actions come out of direct preferences about something like race or gender, right? I'll be focusing on race in this lecture. We're instead going to think that discriminatory actions come about due to beliefs about the association between race or gender or something else that you're discriminating on and some other characteristic that you actually care about. In other words, whereas in Becker's models, we assumed that a prejudiced employer was an employer who just liked working with white people, right? Liked hiring white people, disliked hiring black people. In a statistical discrimination model, we're going to assume that the employer has no direct preferences about race, right? They don't really care about whether they're hiring a white person or a black person, but they do have preferences about something else that they associate with race. So they're going to make assumptions about people based on their race. Those assumptions are going to drive their decisions. And this is going to be important. This is going to be an important difference because it implies that the process by which people make those assumptions and learn about those assumptions is going to either increase or decrease their level of discriminatory behavior. Okay, so to make this a little more concrete, let's imagine a stupid little situation, right? Particularly, let's imagine that you are a recruiter for a yacht salesman company, right? You're trying to sell yachts. And your goal is to hire people as salespeople who are going to be as effective as possible, or going to sell as many yachts as possible, right? Make sense? Now, one of the things that's really important for whether someone is able to sell yachts, let's imagine, right? I don't know anything about the yacht business, but let's imagine that one of the things that's really important for someone's ability to sell yachts is going to be the number of rich friends they have, right? Someone who has rich friends might have a much easier time selling yachts than somebody who doesn't know any rich people. Make sense? On top of this, let's imagine that this particular employer, right, in the yacht sales business, believes that white applicants for salesperson jobs are more likely to have rich friends than are black applicants. So let's imagine particularly that they believe that for white applicants, you've got let's say a 3 in 4 chance of having a rich friend, right? A 1 in 4 chance of no rich friend. Whereas for black applicants, you've got the opposite, right? You've got a 1 in 4 chance of having a rich friend according to this employer, and a 3 in 4 chance of having no rich friend, right? So this is employer belief. Other than that though, let's imagine that race plays no role at all in this story, right? So your likelihood of selling yachts, your ability to sell yachts, is determined entirely by the number of rich friends you have. Race plays no additional role in your ability to sell yachts. Your employer doesn't believe that race plays any role in your ability to sell yachts, other than its effect on having a rich friend. And let's imagine, right, to put some more fit numbers on this, let's imagine that if you've got rich friends, you're going to bring in $160,000 in profit for your company in a given year, right, in revenue above cost. Whereas if you have no rich friend, you're going to sell fewer yachts, right? Let's imagine that you're only going to make $40,000 for your employer. Make sense? Just putting fake numbers on here. So let's think about what this implies about how much your employer is likely to offer to a job applicant, right, in earnings, to a white job applicant relative to a black job applicant. Well, if the employer is purely interested in making money, right, they don't care at all about, on the one hand, they don't have any direct preferences about white or black employees, but on the other hand, they don't have any compunctions about offering racist deals, right? They don't have any compunctions about treating white and black employees differently. What we'd expect them to do is to offer each employee a salary up to how much they expect that employee to make for the firm, right? In other words, what we're going to say is that the expected salary here is going to be the expectation of your sales given your race. This makes sense? So what's our expectation of your sales given your race? It's essentially going to be the sales you make under each possible circumstance, right? If you happen to have a rich friend, or if you don't happen to have a rich friend, times the likelihood that you have a rich friend or don't have a rich friend, right? So this is going to be the sales if you're rich, right, given a rich friend, times the probability that you're rich, plus sales if you're not rich, times probability not rich. This makes sense? So what this is essentially telling us is how much we think someone's going to sell on average, given our expectations about how likely it is that they're rich, right? How likely it is that they're not rich. Make sense? Wonderful. So for a white employee, get rid of these lines here. For a potential white employee, this is going to be 160,000 times the likelihood that you have a rich friend, which is 3/4, plus 40,000 times the likelihood that you don't have a rich friend, right, which is 1/4. So if we do this math, right, this is going to be 60,000 times 3/4 is 45,000. Oh, sorry, 160,000 times 3/4 is going to be, oh my goodness, 120,000, right, plus 10,000. So this is going to be 130,000, right? In contrast, if you're a black employee, then they're going to think that you're going to make 160,000 with probability 1/4, or 40,000 with probability 1/4. I'm sorry, with probability 3/4, right? Which is going to be 40,000 plus 30,000 is $70,000. Does this make sense? So essentially what we're saying is, if you're just purely trying to maximize your profits, right, make as much money as possible, you're indifferent to race other than what you perceive race to tell you about the likelihood that someone does or does not have a rich friend, the consequence is going to be that you're going to think you'll make money on average, offering white employees up to $130,000 in salary. You'll only think you can make up to $70,000 off of a black employee, so you'll offer black employees lower salaries. This make sense? Okay, so how is this model different from what we saw with Becker? And why is this important? Well, first of all, I want to talk about why this is not different. In this case, and in the Becker taste-based discrimination case, what we're observing here is discrimination. It is discrimination, right? What we're seeing here is, even if the employer doesn't directly care about whether a potential employee is white or black, they're treating their employees very differently on the basis of that employee's race, right? They are discriminating on the basis of race when they're making wage offers to their employees. The difference between this and Becker's taste-based model is that we have more of an underlying understanding of where that discrimination comes from, right? And as a result, this makes some predictions about how that discrimination might change. If we think that prejudice for white employees and against black employees came from beliefs about specific other characteristics, right? Like your likelihood of having a rich friend, we would expect that the level of prejudice, the level of discrimination, is going to change when the employer's beliefs change. So if the employer was wrong about your likelihood of having a rich friend based on your race, we might think that given enough observations, right, as they get more exposed to different employees, they might change their beliefs, right? They might realize that they're underestimating the likelihood that black people know rich people, and as a result, increase their wage offers for black employees. On the other hand, if the real information that they get confirms their beliefs, we don't expect their level of prejudice to change, right? If they're correct about the relative likelihood that white and black individuals have rich friends, then they're going to continue making these wage offers and not change their decisions. A really important difference is in whether or not this employer is going to have to pay a bigot tax. Remember, in Becker's world, employers who engaged in discrimination, right, who offered higher wages to white workers than to black workers, suffered lower profits as a consequence of this, right, because their labor costs were inflated. In this world, if this employer is accurately judging the likelihood that white and black employees have rich friends, the opposite is going to be the case. They're going to maximize their profits by treating white and black employees differently, because even if their guesses are wrong about any particular person, right, even if they're offering really insultingly low offers to some very well-connected black people, right, who know lots and lots of rich yacht buyers, their guesses are going to be more accurate on average by discriminating by race than they would be if they didn't discriminate by race. And in fact, as a consequence of this, in a world where statistical discrimination is based on real differences between black and white workers, we would expect that unprejudiced employers are going to end up paying a tax in terms of lower profits. In other words, an employer who looks at this and says it's unethical to offer different salaries to different workers based on race, I'm going to offer $100,000 to everyone, is going to lose money on average relative to their competitors, because they're going to lose out on white employees that would have sold a lot of yachts on average. They'll lose on black employees who wouldn't have, or they'll hire black employees who sell fewer yachts on average. Right? So as a consequence of this, one way to think about this is that when statistical discrimination occurs on the basis of real average differences, right, between people on the basis of race or gender or other characteristics on which people discriminate, right, sexual orientation, etc., we can think of this as the kind of discrimination that would be done by a computer. Right, if we tried to write an algorithm that looked at a bunch of data about people and made salary offers based on expected yacht sales, that algorithm would engage in this kind of discrimination. The algorithm would not engage in what we might think of as Becker's taste-based discrimination, because the algorithm doesn't have any non-data driven information or beliefs about race, gender, sexuality, etc. Does this make sense? Okay, wonderful. So what we're going to do in the next video is explore a model by Stephen Coate and Glenn Lowry called Will Affirmative Action Policies Eliminate Negative Stereotypes? And essentially what this is going to do is to take these two implications of statistical discrimination, right? The one that employers are going to be rewarded for statistical discrimination rather than punished by the market if their beliefs about differences between groups are correct. And the second, that employers' level of prejudice and level of discrimination is going to be influenced by changes in their information about their employees. This model is going to take these two predictions and combine them with an analysis of the way that being subject to discrimination influences the choices of white and black employees. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this discrimination model and use it to explore one circumstance under which discrimination can be self-sustaining. Great.